Imagine for a moment if COVID-19 emerged not from Wuhan, China, a city of 11 million people, but rather just a few hours north in rural Mongolia, or even further north in Arctic Russia, where the nomadic reindeer herders have very little access to healthcare services, to cell phones, or to the internet. How long would it have taken until it was recognized? What effects would it have had on the local populations? And how much worse could it have been if we didn't know about it for weeks or months or for years? Perhaps it's a weird question to ask, but this is one of the many reasons that I do the work that I do. I study diseases in one of the most far remote corners of the earth, the Arctic. The Arctic is a rugged place, but it's beautiful, it's vast, and it's also sparsely populated. It's the region that 10 distinct groups of Indigenous people call home, and they've called it home for generations. It's also the place that many of our most iconic wildlife species, the polar bear, the muskox, the narwhal, and the caribou, have thrived up until recently. The Arctic is under increasing stress. It's warming at 3 times the rate of the rest of the world. Permafrost is thawing. The multi-year sea ice is disappearing. Already, this warming has altered the patterns of climate-sensitive diseases in the Arctic. What happens there, what affects Arctic peoples, Arctic animals, and Arctic ecosystems directly today will soon affect all of us. So, if we can learn to collaborate with the Indigenous people who have lived in this region for generations, learn to listen and value their wisdom side by side with the traditional scientific ways of knowing, we can get better at detecting and preventing the spread of disease in some of the most remote and vulnerable areas of the world. And perhaps along the way, we'll also learn some lessons that are more broadly applicable to our everyday life. So how did I end up studying disease in the Arctic? I was born and raised in Calgary, Canada, but my heart and soul were always out at the land, our family getaway, a few hours to the north in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. I thought I wanted to be a wildlife biologist, but those hopes were crushed when someone told me, no, there's no jobs in wildlife biology. You should look somewhere else. So I decided I'd give veterinary medicine a try. I thought maybe in veterinary medicine, I'd be able to pursue this interest in wildlife and my newly found desire to work in the Arctic. So I went to vet school for 4 grueling years, and then I headed north to the furthest vet clinic I could find in Canada. It was in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. It was okay. I enjoyed private practice, but after a year, I got a letter. This is in the days when we still got letters, from an old classmate of mine, Birgit Baker. And Birgit was super excited. She was saying, I'm going to study polar bears. And I sat back and I thought to myself, what the heck am I doing here, squeezing anal glands of dogs when Birgit's out there living my dream? I quickly phoned down to Saskatoon, my old vet school, and talked to Gary Wobesser. I said, Dr. Wobesser, I'd love to come back to graduate school. I want to work in wildlife, and I want to work on disease in some large Arctic mammal. Gary said, well, that's great. We've just discovered a new lungworm in muskoxen. Now, the lungworm's name is Ummingmuck strongylus padlacucensis. This is the first worm that's ever been named in a native North American language. Ummingmuck is the Inuinuktun, or the Inuit word for muskox. Padlakuk is the local region that the lungworm was first found in. My job was to find the worms, describe the worms, figure out how the muskox gets the worms, and determine what the worms do to muskoxen and how widespread this worm was in the Arctic. So what did I find? Well, in the end, I think I found a pretty charismatic worm. 65 centimeters long. This is a big worm. It was living in cysts in the lungs of muskoxen, and muskox got it by eating slugs or snails. Yes, there are slugs and snails in the Arctic. So essentially what happens is these adult worms live balled up in these cysts in the lungs. They produce millions of eggs a day. These hatch, they're coughed up, swallowed, and passed in the muskox poop. Slugs crawl by. The worms invade the foot of the slugs, and inside the slugs, they have to develop to what we call an infective stage that can infect the next muskox. Now, what's interesting about this story is that this development in the slug depends on temperature. The warmer it is, the faster the worm develops, the faster the next muskox can get infected. And through my thesis, I found out that, in fact, this life cycle had already changed. It had used to be a 2-year life cycle, but now it could be completed in 1 year. And in the end, really, this became a thesis about climate change. It wasn't just about a parasite. It was about climate change. This was in the 90s when people were only starting to think about it. My prediction at the last part of my thesis was this worm, which was just restricted in its range on the Arctic tundra, was very likely to move further north if climate change continued. But then another mentor of mine, John Nishi, the wildlife biologist in Kugluktuk, the community I was working in, he said, "Come on, Sue, you need to come and tell your research, talk about your research to the local hunters." And what I found out when I talked to the Indigenous harvesters, when I talked to the schools, is that the questions I thought were really interesting weren't really the ones that they were worried about. They wanted to know, are muskoxen safe to eat? Are muskoxen going to be here in the future? Will they be here for future generations? I learned that they were essential for the culture of people. They were food, they were used to create tools, and they were also part of their income through selling hides of animals that they'd harvested. The undercoat of the muskox is this fascinating wool. It's the warmest fiber in the world, and garments that are made out of that wool are worth thousands of dollars. What I came to understand was that muskoxen and other wildlife in the Arctic were not just a source of food and income. This was not just a luxury, it was a necessity to help combat food insecurity in the Arctic. Now, the area that I'm working is in Inuit Nunangat, the homelands of the Inuit people in Canada. This area has the highest rate of food insecurity in Canada. Communities rely on outside transportation to get their food there. Food and other supplies come by barge. If you have enough money, you can order all your dry goods all at once and send them north. But if you don't have a lot of disposable income, you can't do that. Food comes by plane, very expensive on a pound-for-pound basis. It may come by ice road if you have an ice road coming into your community in the winter. The result of this is that food is incredibly expensive, as is the cost of living. For example, it costs probably 150 to 200% more to live in Kugluktuk, Nunavut, than it does in Calgary, Alberta. The problem is that jobs are few in these communities, they're seasonal, and there's an astounding amount of wage inequity. Inuit households' incomes are well below the poverty line, while most non-Inuit household incomes are well above and some of the best wages in the country. So what this means is there is a very high rate of food insecurity in Inuit people in northern Canada. For example, in Nunavut, 70% of Inuit households are living in a state of food insecurity. 35% are experiencing severe food insecurity. Now, to combat this food insecurity, a sustainable wildlife harvest will help. However, wildlife are also suffering the effects of climate change in the Arctic, and in particular, as associated with disease. For example, Omingmuk strongylus, the muskox lungworm. At the end of my thesis, I predicted it would expand its range further north. 10 years later, it has. It's moved its way up into the Arctic islands and has made its way several hundred kilometers north. That's a direct result of climate warming. Beyond the muskox lungworm, though, we are also seeing disease emergence in other species. In recent years, we've seen large-scale mortality events for seals, for seabirds, and for muskoxen in the Arctic. We're seeing drastic population declines of wildlife species. For some of these, disease is associated with it. For others, we're not sure. For example, caribou, which are the staple of the diet for Inuit people in the Arctic. Over the last 2 decades, we've lost somewhere between 2.5 and 5 million caribou from the Arctic tundra. This is a 70% to 90% decline in most populations. We're also seeing the invasion of more temperate species, magpies, robins. They're common for you and I, but they're new to the Arctic. Killer whales, salmon. All of these species are making their way further north as the temperatures are warming, and with them, they're bringing their parasites and pathogens. We really don't know what these are going to do to the Arctic ecosystem. So sadly, the Arctic is really a great place to study climate change. It's a relatively simple system. Climate change is happening incredibly rapidly here, and we are already observing the effects of these changes. So how do we deal with these dramatic changes? What we need to do is be able to detect and respond to the emerging wildlife health issues in a timely manner to protect both human and wildlife health. To be effective, this really needs to be designed in the Arctic and for the Arctic. And this is what my group has been working on for the last several years. We partner with local Indigenous people to monitor the health of caribou and muskox populations. We call this community-based wildlife health surveillance. Our interest as scientists is how climate change is affecting wildlife disease and sustainability. We see the Arctic as a model to understand the effects of climate change on disease. But we also want to respond to the concerns of the community. And what do they want to know? They want to know if the meat of their caribou and muskoxen are still safe to eat. They want to know if they'll still have caribou and muskoxen for generations to come. So we founded our program on a principle of two-eyed seeing. This is a guiding principle that Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall coined in 2004. What Albert Marshall said is that we need to be learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of Western knowledges and ways of knowing, and learning to use both of these eyes together for the benefit of all. So our program brings together different ways of knowing. On one side, we've got Indigenous knowledge. On the other side, we've got scientific knowledge. And in between, we have a hunter-based sampling program. We start our program with baseline interviews in the community. By doing this, we can identify local concerns and the directions forward. For example, one harvester told us, "We hear stories about muskox dying, and it is very scary to use the parts of the muskox. We are concerned for the animals. We are concerned for our next generation. We need to prepare ourselves on how to prepare the next generation for these changes." We also document the knowledge on history and current status of population that the Indigenous harvesters hold. And to do this, we use really fun little tools. We use beans to try and document the relative change over time, the number of animals people have seen over time, the different types of diseases, the body condition that animals may have. Harvesters pile these beans on piles to say, in the past, there was half the animals were really fat and half weren't, and today most of them are skinny. We use maps. People sit down around maps and they'll show you where they travel on the land. They'll show you where muskoxen or caribou used to be, where they are today, and what are the important habitats. And we also listen to the narratives. While we can put the beans and the maps into figures, into tables, and into graphs, we always link the narratives. What are the people telling us about these situations in order to ensure we are honest to the information that's being generated from Indigenous knowledge? Through this process, we're able to develop and strengthen our partnerships. It's the first step of developing trust. The second component of our program is a harvester-based sampling program. Here, subsistence harvesters, so harvesters who are hunting animals for food to feed their family and community, will collect samples and data from animals that they are getting for food. We use these samples for biological monitoring. Now, you can't just go and say, "Can you go and collect a bunch of things for me and bring them back?" You need to do this in a way that ensures the samples are collected in a standardized manner, but also that the harvesters are willing to provide you these samples. And so we've spent a lot of time negotiating, working with harvesters to find out what is special to them that they don't want to give up, and what we need to make sure our project and our science is rigorous. For example, it may be extremely difficult to collect blood from a caribou when it's minus 48 degrees outside. So rather than collecting blood into a test tube, we've developed a method with filter paper. They just have to dip filter paper strips into the blood and put it in an envelope. In some cases, harvesters don't want to give up tissues that we think are really important. So we like to have kidneys. Kidneys are a delicacy. So we only take one. We only ask for one. Sometimes parts of the body are really important for clothing. The lower leg bone, which we ask for in our kit, has the fur that's used to make mucklucks. When caribou are scarce, people don't want to give this up because they need that fur to make mucklucks, so they've got proper clothing to be out on the land. So what sort of information do we get from these kits? Well, we collect fur, and from that fur we can tell if an animal was stressed when that fur was growing, so usually during the summer months. We can also tell about the trace mineral status. Does it have enough of those essential trace minerals like copper, like selenium? We get a kidney. From that, we can tell what the body condition is like. We also test for contaminants. Remember the question, is it safe to eat? This is how we're responding to the harvester's needs. We do collect the leg bone when we can, and we can look at that for parasites, for body size, and for body condition. We collect blood on filter paper. This is an easy one for harvesters to do, and from there, we can look for different diseases, we can determine if the animal's pregnant, and we can test for other hormones. And we also give to them a bag, and we call it unusual stuff. That's how it's labeled. And that's exactly what it sounds like, is they are able to put things that are unusual in there. Or if they're not comfortable handling it, they can write this down and tell us, or they can take a picture. And this bag of unusual stuff is often the way that we discover new things, new diseases, things that had previously been unknown to science. There's also a harvester form. So we ask harvesters about their opinion about the animal. Up till now, everything we've done is our scientific way of looking at things. With this harvester form, we recognize that harvesters have a much broader context than we do. They've grown up with these animals. They've grown up with the knowledge that's been passed down to them through generations. They know if it's the fall, they know what an animal should look like at that time of year versus the spring. And so they can input their opinion, their assessment of the animal based on their context and their lifelong experience on the landscape and with those animals. So what have we found through this program? Well, we found a lot of things, and I can only touch on a few. One of the things that I want to talk about is how we found that traditional knowledge, the indigenous knowledge from harvesters in Kugluktuk, forecast a population decline for caribou. Now, this was a case where we had access to interviews that had been done actually back in 2003. Unfortunately, those interviews had not been analyzed at the time, so we got them in 2018. When we looked at those interviews, what we found is harvesters in 2003 were telling us about skinny animals. They were telling us that the animals were far away. They weren't able to get caribou. They had moved further away. They were telling us that the caribou had more diseases. They said, there's just not quite as many here today than there was 10 years ago. Fast forward to 2018, when population surveys were done. That population of caribou had plummeted from 40,000 to 4,000 animals. Had we analyzed those interviews in 2003, we would have known this was coming. The question is, would we have responded to it? Would we have believed the knowledge that was coming from the communities? I would hope so. There's a bit of a silver lining on this caribou herd because our harvester-based sampling program has actually shown that perhaps these animals are improving. What we're seeing over the last 5 years from the samples that the harvesters have provided to us on this herd is that the animals are actually getting a little bit fatter. They're actually less stressed, and the pregnancy rates look like they're going up. So maybe this is now forecasting that the herd is starting to recover. Only time will tell us about that. So the other thing that we've learned from these sampling kits is we've learned about new diseases in muskoxen and in caribou. For example, with the muskox interviews, people told us that there were fewer calves. They told us that muskoxen were limping. So we thought, well, what causes that? And we looked at our veterinary books. We said, okay, well, these different diseases do. Let's test for them. And what we found is that the muskoxen actually had a very high rate of brucellosis. Now, this is interesting because we didn't think muskoxen could carry brucellosis. We knew it was in caribou. And here, because of what the harvesters had been telling us, we were able to detect brucellosis in these animals. Harvesters also told us about scabs on the nose of muskoxen. And they said, we used to see these a little bit, but now we're seeing this a lot. So they submitted some noses into that abnormalities bag. We took those abnormalities, we looked at them in the lab, and sure enough, we found a virus that we didn't know had been there in muskoxen. Again, this was sort of interesting because it was new to science. The harvesters knew that syndrome had existed in muskoxen in the past and had increased. So it was a way of co-learning. They told us there was this syndrome, these scabs. We were able to take those samples and say, this is what's causing this. Now, both these diseases are actually quite important because A, they affect muskox populations, but B, they're diseases people can get. So again, through these conversations, through this sampling, we've been able to go back and tell people what are the diseases these muskoxen have and what do they need to do in order to protect themselves so they themselves don't get sick from handling animals. Now, the other thing that this process that we've been going through, this community-based surveillance, has done is it actually allowed us to detect a major disease outbreak that science had totally missed. So in 2014, in response to community concerns about how the muskoxen were doing, a PhD student, Matilda Tomaselli, interviewed harvesters. And she asked them, how are muskoxen doing? Tell me about the sick ones. Tell me about the dead ones. Well, at that time, as scientists, we knew that there had been 10 dead muskoxen near the community of Ekaluktutyuk. By the time Matilda had finished her interviews, we knew that there had actually been about 20 dead muskoxen near Ekaluktutyuk in 2010. In 2011, there was 30 or more, and in 2012, there's 50 or more. Science had totally missed this outbreak. Harvesters also shed light on this outbreak in many other ways. They told us not just the years and the number of animals. They told us where the dead animals were. They told us about the animals. And what they told us was they were in pretty good condition. They weren't dying of starvation. They were all age classes. They were young ones, old ones, males, females. They also told us that these die-offs happened mostly in the summertime. So all of this is information that we did not have as scientists sitting back in our desks in Calgary or wherever we were. The interviews were absolutely invaluable to detect this outbreak. Now, the next population survey of muskoxen happened, I think it was in 2016, and it showed, again, a dramatic decline of this population. We had the tools then to say, disease was probably a big contributor to this decline, versus putting our hands up in the air and saying, I don't know where the animals went. So what we've learned is we just had to ask and listen, and we'd know a lot more about these animals. So in a nutshell, what has this program told us? The interviews have established the past and current status of animals. They've established what concerns people have, and they've allowed us to target our science towards addressing those concerns. The Indigenous knowledge forecasted a decline of a caribou population, and it detected a major epidemic in muskoxen that we had missed. The ongoing sampling and ongoing conversations have allowed us to detect changes in caribou and muskox health, and perhaps use this in real time to say, you know what, the animals are looking good, animals are looking bad, we need to change our management strategies to address that. And it's been a great two-way exchange of information. Together, this information allows the wildlife managers and the communities to come together for solutions, as opposed to waiting for population surveys to tell us that the population has declined and then try to do something then. So why does this program work? It really is a true collaboration and an ongoing collaboration between communities, scientists, and governments. It's a collaboration that values traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge side by side. It addresses common concerns around wildlife, sustainability of wildlife, and food safety. It isn't a top-down approach. It really came out of the communities themselves. All parties are involved in designing the studies, generating the data, interpreting the data, so everyone trusts the results. We don't take the information we get from interviews to the public until we've taken it back to the community and said, is this what you meant? Did I interpret this correctly? There's a mutual benefit because what this does is it makes both types of knowledge, the scientific knowledge and the traditional knowledge, available to all stakeholders. It provides local employment, skills development for harvesters, and knowledge exchange. And it's also a holistic program. We don't stop just at the sampling and the interviews that I've talked to you about. We also work with the communities. We work with the youth. We bring the science into the classrooms, building new relationships with those youth for the future generations. And finally, when this work all comes together, when it ends up in a scientific paper or in a presentation, we share the credit. It's not just the Southern scientists who have done this work. It's clear that it's a network, it's a partnership, it's a collaboration. We've learned many lessons. First, the scientific community has a lot to learn from Indigenous peoples. We just need to open our minds and listen. I know that I'm a much better researcher than I was 20 years ago because I've incorporated this way of thinking into my work and into the work that my students do today. It requires a long-term commitment. This is not something that happens on a single grant cycle. We need to develop relationships. We need to build trust. There's a long history of colonization, residential schools, marginalization, and science not returning to the communities. We've got a long hill to climb to make up for these. We need to honor different ways of knowing. We need to come back to that principle of two-eyed seeing and recognize that two knowledge systems can exist side by side, and by working together, we can learn much more. But we also need to move forward beyond what I've told you today. We still put Indigenous knowledge into our Western knowledge systems. This is still a problem. We still want to count. We still want graphs. We want tables in order to do something, in order to manage wildlife. We need to start to think beyond that on how can we use Indigenous knowledge in its holistic system instead of trying to cram it into ours. Arctic peoples and Indigenous peoples globally are resilient and they are innovative. They know their environment, they know their peoples, and they know what they need to succeed. But a history of colonization, marginalization, and inequities has set them back. However, given the appropriate resources, locally developed solutions will emerge and succeed. Instead of us saving, let's think about enabling. I always tell my students when we go north, I say, recognize you have your own culture. That how you've been raised influences what you think is right or wrong or the truth. But there are many different ways of knowing, many different ways of seeing, and many different ways of doing. Sometimes what you've learned as the truth isn't the only truth, and sometimes it's not even the best truth. Life is much richer when you embrace different worldviews. Thank you.